What transforms a national icon, a celebrated hero of war, into a creature of unimaginable evil? On the 26th of October 1440, a vast crowd gathered to witness the execution of Gilles de Rais. This man, once a comrade in arms to Joan of Arc and a champion for France, was now condemned to burn, his name having become a byword for a depravity so profound it defied belief. This is the chronicle of a man who possessed immense power and was utterly destroyed by it, and how the eventual hand of justice, when it fell, was as brutally definitive as the crimes it sought to punish. The 15th century was an era accustomed to brutality and violence, yet the deeds of Gilles de Rais sent a shudder of horror through the very heart of his society. His journey from a respected marshal of France to a demonic butcher of children serves as a chilling exploration of what happens when authority is left unchecked, and the horrifying abyss a human soul can plunge into when all moral and ethical boundaries are removed. Born around 1404, Gilles de Rais entered a world of immense wealth and privilege. As the heir to sprawling estates across Brittany and Anjou, he stood as one of France's most affluent noblemen. His early life was a narrative of honor and valor. He carved out a formidable reputation as a military leader during the 100 Years' War, most notably fighting side by side with Joan of Arc during her astonishing campaigns to expel the English from French territory. It was at the pivotal siege of Orleans in 1429 that the young baron cemented his heroic status, serving as one of Joan's most loyal and trusted commanders. To see Gilles de Rais in those days was to see the very embodiment of nobility and strength. He was described as tall and powerfully built, with long, dark hair and an aristocratic bearing that commanded deference and respect, both on the fields of war and within the opulent royal court. In recognition of his invaluable service, King Charles VII bestowed upon him one of the kingdom's greatest military honors, appointing him Marshal of France. His standard flew proudly next to Joan's, and his sword was instrumental in achieving French victories that had seemed utterly impossible only months prior. Yet, even amidst this period of celebrated glory, discerning eyes could detect unsettling currents beneath the surface. Gilles cultivated a fascination with wealth and ostentatious luxury that teetered on the edge of obsession. His expenditures were astronomical. He supported a private chapel boasting a choir of hundreds, financed and staged grandiose theatrical plays, and began to surround himself with a retinue of alchemists, scholars, and mystics whose interests drifted ominously toward the occult. It seems the seeds of his future corruption were already finding purchase in the rich soil of absolute power and unrestrained ambition. A critical turning point arrived in 1430. When Joan of Arc was captured by English forces and, a year later, burned at the stake, a fundamental part of Gilles de Rais seemed to break. The profound loss of his spiritual and military compatriot, coupled with the abrupt end of his own wartime glory, left a void. He began to seek new, more potent forms of power and stimulation. It was in this new, aimless chapter of his life that he embarked on the catastrophic descent into a darkness that would not only define his legacy but utterly consume his soul. Following Joan's execution, Gilles withdrew from public life, retreating to his vast collection of estates, most notably his formidable castle at Meticulously in Brittany. Shielded from the prying eyes of the royal court and the structured discipline of military life, he gave free rein to his most depraved fantasies. His colossal fortune, estimated to be over 200,000 livres, a sum equivalent to many millions of dollars today, gave him the means to finance any whim, any dark curiosity, without consequence or limitation. Tragically, these interests quickly soured into the macabre. The baron developed an all-consuming obsession with alchemy, fanatically believing he could perform the great work of transmuting common metals into pure gold through the use of forgotten, arcane rituals. He actively sought out and employed practitioners of the dark arts. The most influential of these was an Italian magician, a charlatan named Francesco Prelati, who boasted of holding the keys to demonic evocation and conjuration. Under the sinister mentorship of Prelati, Gilles began to stage increasingly complex and perverse occult ceremonies. The goal was to summon demonic entities that he believed could grant him the one thing his inheritance could not guarantee: limitless, supernatural power and wealth. These diabolical rituals demanded sacrifices. And it was here, in the pursuit of forbidden knowledge, that Gillis's moral decay reached its nadir. While he may have begun by sacrificing animals, historical accounts strongly indicate a swift and horrifying progression to human victims. He specifically targeted children, driven by the twisted belief that their innocence and purity would be a more potent offering to the infernal powers he wished to control. The isolated, foreboding nature of his castles, combined with the absolute, unquestioned authority he wielded over his lands, created the perfect, horrifying laboratory for these atrocities to unfold, entirely shielded from the outside world. The transformation was now irreversible. The hero who had once fought valiantly for the soul of France was now using his immense power to commit acts that beggared belief, turning his fortresses into theaters of unimaginable horror. Gilles de Rais owned several castles across his vast territories, but it was within the stone walls of Machecoul and Tiffauges that his evil found its most prolific expression. These imposing fortresses, designed and built to repel invading armies, were repurposed into private hells. Their chambers became prisons and torture rooms for innocent children, who endured agonies so unspeakable that contemporary chroniclers found themselves at a loss for words to adequately describe them. The very stones of these castles seemed to absorb the terror, bearing silent witness to crimes that would poison the local folklore and haunt the surrounding countryside for centuries. The method for acquiring victims was as systematic as it was monstrously cruel. Gilles dispatched his loyal servants and accomplices into the nearby villages and towns with a specific mission, to scout for children from impoverished families. These predators would approach parents, worn down by hardship and desperation, with what sounded like a miraculous opportunity. They offered employment for their sons and daughters in the great baron's household, spinning tales of good food, warm beds, and respectable work. For families struggling against the constant threat of starvation, such an offer felt like an act of divine intervention, a rescue from a life of misery. They willingly handed over their children, believing they were securing a better future for them. The moment the castle gates closed behind them, however, the children were plunged into a nightmare. They were not led to servants' quarters but to lightless, subterranean dungeons, where they were stripped of their clothes and dignity. Here, they were subjected to prolonged and systematic torture, a horrific ordeal designed to satisfy both Gillis's sadistic sexual urges and the supposed requirements of his occult ceremonies. The historical record, drawn from the sworn testimonies given at his subsequent trial, paints a picture of depravity so extreme that it challenges the limits of human comprehension. The victims, some as young as 6 or 7 years old, endured a gauntlet of sexual assault, brutal physical torture, and profound psychological torment before being ritually murdered. Gilles was not a distant observer, he was an active and eager participant. Some children were strangled slowly, as he watched their life ebb away, reportedly deriving a perverse pleasure from their final, agonized struggles. Others were decapitated or had their limbs severed while they were still alive and conscious. The Baron, according to testimony, took a particular, ghoulish satisfaction in the very moment of death, obsessed with the belief that the peak of his victim's terror and pain would amplify the magical potency of his demonic rituals. The full, staggering scope of his cruelty was laid bare only during his trial, when his former accomplices, one by one, testified to the methodical and repetitive nature of the horrors. These court records provide a uniquely chilling portal into the mind of a man who had cast off every shred of human empathy. Witness accounts described how Gilles would often engage in grotesque displays of false affection, kissing the children moments before he killed them, a horrifying mockery of tenderness that served as a prelude to their annihilation. This jarring contrast between a gentle gesture and the impending violence was a key component of his sadism, a form of psychological torture that was as integral to his pleasure as the physical acts that followed. The methods of murder were varied, but all were united by a common thread of maximizing and prolonging the victim's suffering. Some children were hung from meat hooks and garrote, allowing Gilles to savor their final moments. Others were subjected to sexual assaults of such violence that the acts themselves were fatal. Still others were consciously dismembered, their screams echoing unanswered through the cold stone chambers while the Baron looked on with what was described as rapt satisfaction. After each murder, an equally systematic process of concealment began. The bodies were taken to the castle's massive furnaces and burned until nothing remained but ash and charred bone fragments. These ashes were then scattered or secretly buried in unmarked pits, a final, cruel act that ensured the victims' families would be trapped in a limbo of uncertainty, never knowing the fate of their lost children. This meticulous destruction of evidence, combined with the shield of his noble status and the seclusion of his domains, allowed Gilles de Rais to continue his killing spree for nearly a decade without fear of detection. The sheer scale of the slaughter is difficult to fathom. Conservative historical estimates place the number of murdered children at a minimum of 80, though many historians, and Gilles' own confession, suggest the true figure may have been closer to 200. Gilles did not act alone in this empire of pain. He cultivated a close-knit circle of accomplices who were bound to him by shared guilt and reward, creating a network of complicity that was essential to his long reign of terror. These minions ranged from enthusiastic participants who seemed to share his sadistic tastes, to more reluctant servants who were coerced into silence and cooperation through threats and bribery. Chief among his confederates were his body servants, Henriette Gren and Etienne Corillard, who was known as Poitou. These men were his confidants and his henchmen, participating directly in every stage of the crimes, from abduction to torture to the final disposal of the bodies. They carried out their master's horrific commands with a loyalty that appeared absolute, a bond forged in blood and paid for with gold. Another key figure was his own cousin, a fellow nobleman named Gilles de Rais, who provided both financial backing and moral encouragement for the Baron's dark pursuits. His involvement demonstrates how the immense privilege of the aristocracy could create a shield of impunity around even the most monstrous crimes. Providing the twisted ideological framework for the bloodshed was the Italian conjurer, Francesco Prelati. He was the one who convinced Gilles that the serial murder of innocent children was a necessary and sacred component of their magical operations, thus transforming base sadism into a form of perverse religious rite in the Baron's warped mind. For nearly a decade, the immense power of Gilles de Rais's noble station and his staggering wealth served as an impenetrable shield. Medieval society was built on a rigid hierarchy of deference to aristocracy, and few would dare to lodge a formal accusation against a Marshal of France, no matter how persistent the whispers of missing children and dark rituals became among the peasantry. By the late 1430s, however, these rumors had grown into a roar that could no longer be ignored. Yet, the first official challenge to his authority did not come from criminal law, but from the Catholic Church, spurred by his own family. His financial profligacy had become so extreme that he was forced to sell off vast portions of his inherited lands, prompting his relatives to appeal to church authorities to intervene and stop him from squandering the entire family fortune. This legal maneuver cast an unwelcome spotlight on his affairs, creating the first crack in his defenses. In 1440, Gilles made a final, fatal miscalculation that sealed his doom. During a heated property dispute, he brazenly kidnapped a cleric named Jean Leferin and held him prisoner in his castle at Machicoul. This was an act of aggression against a direct representative of the church, a flagrant crime that not even his high rank could protect him from. It was the justification the church needed. The Bishop of Nantes immediately launched an investigation, ostensibly focused on the abduction. But as investigators began to dig into the Baron's life, they quickly unearthed evidence of far more sinister deeds. A floodgate of testimony opened. Servants, finally feeling safe enough to speak, came forward. Grieving parents who had lost their children for years recounted their stories. Neighbors reported the deeply suspicious activities they had long observed at the Baron's castles. The accumulating evidence painted a portrait of systematic child murder on a scale so vast and with a brutality so extreme that it stunned the seasoned investigators. An inquiry that began with a property quarrel had uncovered one of the most monstrous crime sprees in the annals of medieval history. The trial of Gilles de Rais commenced in September 1440 in the city of Nantes. It was an ecclesiastical court, giving it the jurisdiction to try him for the intertwined crimes of heresy and murder. Initially, Gilles was defiant, cloaking himself in arrogance. He refused to recognize the court's authority, claiming that as a Marshal of France, he could only be judged by the king, not by churchmen. This bold front rapidly disintegrated as the trial proceeded. Witness after witness took the stand, their testimonies forming a detailed, consistent, and damning narrative of his crimes. The court heard from parents describing the last time they saw their children, from servants who had witnessed the murders firsthand, and from his own accomplices, who had been granted immunity in exchange for their full testimony. The evidence was irrefutable. Faced with this mountain of proof and the imminent threat of being tortured for a confession, Gilles de Rais finally broke in October 1440. He confessed to everything. His confession was a horrifying masterpiece of detail, delivered with a strange and disturbing mix of profound remorse and lingering pride in his evil. He admitted to the torture and murder of countless children to satisfy both his sexual sadism and his occult ambitions. He claimed to have killed more than he could accurately recall, but estimated the number of his victims to be over 140. The confession detonated like a bomb in medieval society. That this man, this hero who fought beside Joan of Arc, could admit to deeds seemingly spawned from the deepest pits of hell was almost too much to comprehend. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. On October 25, 1440, Gilles de Rais was found guilty on all charges: murder, sodomy, heresy, and the invocation of demons. He was sentenced to death. The method of execution was chosen for its symbolic power. He was to be hanged until dead, and then his body was to be consumed by fire. This dual punishment of hanging and burning was reserved for the most heinous of criminals, a sentence intended not only to punish the flesh but to purify the soul's corruption and serve as a terrifying warning to all. The execution was set for the next day, October 26, 1440. As word spread, thousands of people flocked to a field outside Nantes to witness the end of the monster who had terrorized their communities. For the enormous crowd, which swelled to over 10,000, this was not just justice, it was a necessary public ritual, a collective exorcism to cleanse the land of his evil. Gilles was brought to the scaffold in a simple cart, dressed in plain clothes, stripped of every last vestige of the nobility that had once been his shield. Before the sentence was carried out, he was allowed to address the crowd. He spoke briefly, asking for the forgiveness of God and of the families he had destroyed. Then, the noose was placed around his neck. At the judge's signal, the trapdoor sprung, and the former Marshal of France was dead. But his punishment was not over. His lifeless body was cut down and lowered onto a massive pyre. As the flames were lit, the crowd watched in grim silence as the body of the man who had burned his victims was himself consumed by fire. The blaze raged for hours, ensuring every trace was destroyed, leaving no relic of the monster to be collected or venerated. His ashes were scattered, a final symbolic act of erasure. The story of Gilles de Rais did not end there, it transformed into a timeless and chilling cautionary tale. His case set a powerful legal precedent, demonstrating that no one, not even the highest-ranking noble, was above the law when their crimes were too monstrous to be ignored. Modern criminologists now look back on his case as a startlingly clear early example of a sadistic serial killer, exhibiting the classic traits of targeting vulnerable victims, escalating violence, and a fusion of sexual and ritualistic motives. The flames that took his body turned to ash 6 centuries ago, but the lessons from his fall from hero to monster burn just as brightly, a permanent warning of the darkness that lies dormant in the human soul when power is left absolute and all moral restraints are cast aside.